conference. We're very glad to have all of you here, and thank you for coming. It's my first opportunity to officially welcome people, and I would like to thank everybody who was involved in planning the conference and supporting the conference. In particular, I'd like to thank the Assistant Director of Debate at Idaho State University, Andy Christensen. He has handled all of the logistics, setting up the rooms, ordering the food, getting the flowers. All of those little niceties have been due to him. So thank you, Andy. Lynn Schwartz-Dupree serves on the board of the Women's Debate Institute with me and is a very close friend of mine, so I'm extremely happy to have her here. She got her PhD at the University of Iowa in 2006, and she's a professor of communication studies at Western Washington University. She has a specialization in feminist post-colonial theory, rhetorical studies, and visual communication. Tonight she'll discuss her current book, Curious George, Cultural Icons, Colonialism, and American Exceptionalism. This book takes up Curious George as an example of contemporary colonialism and links race, gender, colonialism, icons, and citizenship. So I'm very excited to hear what she has to say tonight, and I hope you'll please welcome Dr. Schwartz-Dupree.
Thank you so much for having me. I want to begin by thanking Idaho State College of Arts and Letters, Dean Candy Terrell Ames, and Chair Jim D'Souza, as well as the sponsors and co-sponsors, the Cultural Events Committee, the ISU Credit Union, the conference planners, Andy, and my dear host, Sarah Partlow-Lefay, and I'm grateful to the Women's Debate Institute that has really brought so many of us interested in civic engagement together in one space. So what I'll share with you today is a skeleton of a current book project that critically considers Curious George as a referent par excellence to demonstrate how colonialism functions as an insidious and pervasive tool of American exceptionalism. As true of all skeletons, it's void of the fleshier sub-arguments that completes this body of scholarship, but instead highlights and coordinates the ways that we should substantiate understanding cultural icons and the ideologies that they bestow to their audiences. The project uses feminist post-colonial theory to read three dominant discourses in which Curious George circulates. The first is colonial children's literature, second, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and third, Holocaust education. While seemingly dissimilar, these three discourses share in common a rich training ground for U.S. American exceptionalism, one that dismisses its slavery-based roots and promotes STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics as the backbone of the economy and global competitiveness, and it privileges its remembrance of the Holocaust as a motivator for U.S. to take on an American global scheme. The project, in theme with the conference, begins by me telling my own story, a beautiful and challenging negotiation of my identity as mother and professor. I began this project by sitting down with my two young daughters, eager to share with them the stories of my childhood. They were too little to read and barely old enough to speak. I was too sleep-deprived and incredulous with two newborn twins to reason. Yet as an educator and mother, I knew that they would benefit from the gift of literature. So we engaged in the ritual of story time, and on one particular night, I opened the big yellow Curious George book. Not really noticing the two police officers escorting a monkey off in handcuffs, I began to read. This is George. He lived in Africa. He was a good little monkey and always very curious. One day, George saw a man. He had a large yellow straw hat on. George saw him too. I'd like to take him home with me, the man said. And he put his hat on the ground. And of course, George was curious, so he came down from the tree to look at the yellow hat. The hat had once been on the man's head, and George thought it'd be nice to put it on his own head. So he put it on and picked it up. The hat covered George's head and he couldn't see. The man picked him up quickly, popped him into a bag, and George was caught. The man with the big yellow hat put George into a little boat, and a sailor rowed them both across the ocean, or across the water to a big ship. George was sad, but he was still a little curious. On the big ship, big things began to happen. The man took off the bag, and George sat on a little stool, and the man said, "I'm going to take you to the zoo, and you will like it there." The story interrupted our ritual and piqued my attention. Awake with clarity, I read as 4 little newborn eyes stared at the cartoon character wrapped in a burlap bag, ostensibly choking, mouth open with the sack around his neck. Curious George was not as I remembered. Yet the didactic narrative was one that I had encountered countless times. It was a story of African slavery. And while the girls slept, I reread Curious George with mature eyes. Unwilling to give the book away, I tucked it into the closet, and the academic in me went searching for scathing dismissals of this famous African tale. Yielding very little, the project was born. George, I argue, is a cultural icon, a stable figure or object that can adapt over time and space. He's familiar to the public through repeated storytelling and playing an important role in upstanding cultural values. Consider, for example, Superman's commitment to justice, or Barbie's construction of the female body, or Hello Kitty's production of Japan in the wake of globalization. A cultural icon's stability establishes architectural parameters that guarantee an overwhelming sense of comfortability and security for its audiences. Curious George retains 2 architectural features, his monkeyness and his curiosity. Both enable him to be instantaneously identifiable for our youngest and most impressionable citizens. Curious George himself was the brainchild of Margaret and H.A. Rays and made his debut in the supporting 1939 book Celius G. and the 9 Monkeys. While Margaret was the author and H.A. the illustrator, the publisher didn't think that a woman's book would actually sell. So she suggested that H.A. was the author, and he remained so through the first 7 books until he died in 1977. Since the publication, the original Curious George book boasts at least 40 titles and has sold more than 25 million copies worldwide. Despite its popularity, there have been few academics that critique Curious George and the blatant depiction of slavery, but June Cummings is an astute exception. Reading the first 7 of the books, which are considered the original collection, detail how Curious George depicts Americans' cultural ambivalence to its relationship towards slavery. Cummings describes Curious George books as having a parallel narrative structure. So George creates mischief, and because of his lack of obedience and maturity, he is taught a lesson, often by the man in the yellow hat, and assimilates to convention. Cummings enlists ways that George performs a sanitized and ambivalent, approachable, likable version of slavery. George is tricked by the man in the yellow hat to leave the African jungle because he was enticed by objects belonging to the white man. He is captured and forced into new circumstances where he is caught between the worlds of horror and wonder. And George's inability to speak, suggesting that this deficit marks him as the other colonial. And even in the more contemporary works, he is void of speech, although he makes sounds kind of like a baby. While many children's books anthropomorphically grant animals speech, George, she argues, is rendered voiceless, precisely at the moment of capture. Similar strategies have been forced among slaves split into different language groups to prevent their communication. And finally, George, like most slaves, embodies a hybrid colonial subject. On one hand, he's cute and cuddly, and he's partially acceptable. Yes, his blackness, his boyishness, his animalness ultimately maintain his points of difference. While George continuously performs heroic tasks, his hybridity marks him as diasporic other, fluctuating between longing to return home and his desire to fit in. And just as slaves attempted to escape their enslaved conditions through the Middle Passage, so did George. When caught, like slaves, he was restrained, imprisoned, Comic-sized instances in which George's escape, if not literal, at least takes place in his mind. Her astute reading becomes a lucrative launching point for my reading of Curious George as the diasporic victim of colonial history, longing to return to the African jungle. Curious George fans have defended his racist past as a sign of a time, yet the troubling character, the man in the yellow hat, which I take up first, and second, George's longing to return home, suggests that it is racist among its foundation. So first let's talk about the man in the yellow hat. He continues to be the quintessential colonial explorer. George's capture is continuously absent and neglectful paternal excuse for a father. Rather than a typical slave master, the man in the yellow hat performs a more acceptable, benign colonial character, enabling George to play the jubilant slave. The story follows the continuous logic that the man in the yellow hat leaves, George takes on a wild adventure, a celebrated tradition of boys will be boys mantra, and the man in the yellow hat returns and George is deemed a hero. Characterized by his big brimmed yellow hat, the man in the yellow hat is a sanitized companion and owner of George. Featured in every book, the man in the yellow hat is tall, wealthy, white man with dark eyes and dark hair. He's always dressed in a National Geographic style yellow sunny ensemble with a yellow hat and collared shirt. He's almost always accompanied by a sunny yellow tie and army-length, calf-length boots. He's like an amateur explorer, colonizer and simultaneously plays George's rather pathetic father figure, a continued reminder of George's copious yet captive condition. One wonders if George's popularity or publication would even endure if George was accompanied by a woman in a yellow hat. Historically, the treatments of women as explorers or travelers strips them in the public eye from their feminine characteristics. Those who retain their gender, Jane Goodall, for example, are expected to take on a traditional caretaker or protective role or savior. Like most maternal figures, they are expected to shed any need and every need or desire to service those they accompany. Audiences would unlikely have accepted Goodall, she's the woman who takes care of the apes, right? Would have accepted a Goodall-type character, able to steal George or any animal and take them from their natural habitat, unless, however, they were in obvious danger. Thus, for the narrative to remain, George would have had to have been rendered helpless prior to his capture. Thus, his curiosity could not have continuously resulted in his heroism. Equally problematic is the way in which mothers or maternal figures are treated by children's literary critics. Many of you might remember Cedric's famous book, Where the Wild Things Are. Here, Max has a dinner time conflict with his mother and is sent to bed without supper. The plot is premised on the wild adventure of Max's dreams and the journey that children can take in their mind. Yet literary critics like John Bell, among others, draw attention to the imperial narrative advanced by the books and the ways in which Sedgwick's novel is crucified by audiences' preoccupation with the delinquent mother who failed to properly parent by sending him to bed without supper. The example poses a significant problem for the storyline under which George discourse is grounded. At the start, the man in the yellow hat leaves George alone, and then at the end of the book comes back. Thus, if Max's mother is disgraced for failing to send Max to sleep without dinner, one could only imagine what would happen to a woman with a hat who left George for hours without any supervision. Sadly, U.S. culture seems willing to accept or often applaud subpar or pathetic fathers over women whose maternal responsibilities extend beyond these fictitious novels. A second and perhaps more equally troubling theme of George is that they offer a resounding and repetitive theme that corroborate George as a diasporic subject long after the first 7 books that Cummings looks at. In fact, the theme of his desire to return to the jungle is covered in almost every book or episode you might see. Diaspora, derived from the Greek, was originally understood and described as a voluntary or forcible movement of peoples from their homeland into new regions. Diaspora is a central theme in post-colonial theory because, as Sal describes, it is a state of a mind, an imagined state in which the identity is discursively constructed to produce new identities likable to ourselves. I use this notion of subjectivity or diasporic subjectivity as functions George as a member of the African diaspora in the literary series and the Jewish diaspora in Holocaust novels that I'll talk about shortly. In the literary series, George's diasporic desire can be read through his physical longing to be free, his affinity and yearning to be with animals, and his nostalgia for his jungle-like scenery. Several Curious George books have a theme that centers on George's confinement, eventual escape, his freeing of other animals. For example, in Curious George Rides a Bike, the man in the yellow hat wants to celebrate 3 years ago today, I brought you home with me. In the Curious George Flies a Kite, George gravitates towards the neighbor's butter cage, freeing them and letting the bunnies run away. The fluctuation between George's confinement and his assimilation to his new conditions and freedom to run wild suggests a split diasporic subject, one who's working within the newer surroundings while simultaneously longing to return to his native environment. George's attachment to his memory of the native jungle is perhaps the most striking element of his character. The reoccurring image of George's native habitat runs through a series. In some books, the jungle tree is featured in a picture above the man in the yellow hat's breakfast table and then appears among George's own bed. In other books, a puzzle piece or a painting of the wall. In The Ice Cream Surprise, the image of George sweeping the house, and above his bed hangs another image of the jungle. The image is always the same. It's a green and brown depiction of the iconic tree in which George was first introduced to young audiences. The belief that he no longer remembers the tree is suggests otherwise. When I was at the University of Southern Mississippi has a children's collection, an archive in which the Rays had donated over 300 boxes of documents. And on Margaret Ray's 90th birthday, children from all over this country and the world wrote letters talking about their favorite Curious George scene. And over 50% of them pictured him in the iconic jungle tree. In George Takes a Job begins and highlights George as painting a jungle scene in his house. In Curious George Gets a Medal, George jumps onto a dinosaur exhibit in the museum thinking he was in a recreation of his own jungle home. George paints the walls with jungle scenery. Jungle scenery appears in his school, museum, books in the library. And when faced with the decision with a library book of a picture of himself on the jungle on the cover or a dinosaur, George, interestingly, opts for the latter. The library encounter marks an important, distinct moment and sign of diasporic identity. It's one that sometimes restrains its own desire for that which the rational mind knows it cannot place, namely, the return. The jungle is a subtle inclusion in most books and a reminder that typically emerges when George is engaged in civilized activities of the modern world. It appears when he's eating breakfast, making pancakes, or participating in school. George wavers between depictions of freedoms and oppression through these narratives, simultaneously embarking on a new adventure in American landscape, yet gravitating towards what reminds him of his former life of the land. Curious George narratives mimic colonial storylines of white men's explorers, captures, and diaspora. Never are George's antics the subject of critique. Instead, the suggestion that, quote, just like George, children are curious about the world and how the world works. They're natural engineers, mathematicians, and scientists, sets the stage for George's refiguration as a STEM ambassador for parents, teachers, and of course, children. So there's George in various different depictions of the jungle tree. Since the publication of the first Curious George book, the mischievous monkey has only risen to popularity. The cultural icon has expanded across multimedia platforms, including film, interactive technology, New York City. He was the New York City Tourism Emblem of the Year, museum exhibits. In fact, he's the only icon to have a bookstore dedicated to his work alone. In 2012, Google attempted to challenge the Apple-dominated tablet market by releasing the Nexus 7. In its debut advertisement, entitled Curious, viewers are invited into the living room of a blonde, fair-skinned woman. Sitting comfortably on a sunny day, she simultaneously holds her daughter and her tablet and reads the famous Curious George story. The young, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and barefoot daughter listens attentively, and mother reads softly. This is George. He's a little monkey and always very curious. And at that moment, the theme of curiosity begins to mold the narrative of the advertisement. The spot moves to the girl's first curious act. Dressed in a yellow and brown palette of Curious George, she blows into a straw until the wholesome milk overflows in a cloud of bubbles. The theme of George going to the moon is endemic throughout all of his discourses, and Mother continues to read. He builds a rocket ship so he can travel into space. Here, nourishment and curiosity collide as the child transforms, using the Nexus as her own rocket ship centerpiece, taking her broccoli, peas, cauliflower, and drawing what looks like a rocket ship. Do you want to go to space, George? You'll have to be very brave, Mother reads. As the audience observe, the young girl jumps up and down on her bed. In delight, she covers her head in a brown blanket reminiscent of the burlap bag George was first captured in. The music speeds and Mother continues. Everyone get on. We're off to the launching site. Now, running through the house with her tablet in hand, scuba mask, and what looks like a vacuum on her back, the blonde girl prepares her curiosity to take flight. She slows down to check her coordinates, asking Google, "How far is the moon?" Her mother continues, the great moment had come. Carefully putting her makeshift rocking ship helmet on, the young girl speeds out the door to a sunny grass yard where her rocket ship awaits. Google closes by telling potential consumers, the playground is open. The Nexus advertisement conflates the power of curiosity, the George narrative, a world of possibilities safe to girls within the confines of their own home. And through the nostalgia of Curious George, the mother is able to empower her daughter and nourish her family. In turn, the young girl offers potential consumers the possibility that science and technology are acceptable for young white girls, if not necessary, to inspire a curiosity that has neither limits nor danger, but instead offers a universe of endless possibilities for curious exploration. Considering George's materiality as primate, as well as his central character trait, curiosity provides the opportunity to explore both the history of and current relationship connecting science and curiosity. To understand how the West has come to constitute itself in oppositions to monkeys, enable the readers to understand how the tropes of curiosity, essentially in our current scientific discourse, make George a productive vehicle to read current science education policy as both value-free and ideologically neutral. The relationship between curiosity and science has had a long past within our own country. While productive in some instances, it has also produced an exceedingly dangerous racist and sexist connotations that should provide us with a healthy dose of skepticism to the current educational path that thrusts young learners, particularly young girls, to emulate a curious monkey. This section of the project draws primarily on Sandra Harding's feminist theory of post-colonial science and technology studies, a theory that challenges the idea that science and technology were among the gifts that Western imperial powers brought to their colonies as an integral part of the discourse of the civilizing mission, one vaunted by its purveyors and critics of the methods of colonization. The onslaught of Curious George media coincided with the American Competitive Act, initiated by President George Bush, and announced it was to encourage our economy to give the nation's children a firm grounding in science and math. Currently, even though Trump has cut much of the science and technology budget, he still affirms President Obama's $2.9 billion based in children's education for STEM. While the American Competitiveness Act was on the political scene, Curious George made his big screen debut. The film in 2006 grossed $58.3 million in the United States and $70 million worldwide. Yet the director struggled to figure out how the narrative could be written. We can't just have George taken from the jungle. Audiences wouldn't really appreciate that. So the 21st century man with the yellow hat is no poacher, the film director told. So they've updated him. His name is now Ted, and he's been sent off on a mission to capture an African sacred site in Africa to save the museum he works for. Nadisha expresses her distaste for a new storyline in which the man in the yellow hat is an archaeologist and museum curator, as opposed to a gun-toting, pipe-smoking animal poacher in the original series, as an insidious underlying assumption that one could go to Africa and transport significant cultural artifacts to the museum in New York. Granted, this is fiction, but even so, it provides children with a clear lesson of how to understand a new type of contemporary colonization. This 2006 marked the conditions of possibility that George could be free of criticism if he was an ambassador of STEM, since such endeavors marked George with his monkeyness and curiosity. In 2006, also, Public Broadcasting Service adopted a new series to what has now become PBS's most popular kids programming for preschoolers 3 through 5. The television sequel and corresponding Curious George website aims at parents explains, quote, "The Curious George series takes full advantage of his natural curiosity. Using George as a motivator for children to expand their own investigations of the world, George's memorable adventures embody the preschool child in the field of science. The colonial narrative of primeology in which George is encased risks affirming the narratives that so hurt us in the past. While the monkey plays an important role in American cultural history, it is the primate scientists believe to be human, according literally and figuratively," Haraway argues. Primate studies were in fact a colonial affair, one in which the living and dead bodies of monkeys and apes were part of a systematic exchange of colonialism. The use of apes represent black people as sadly conventional in the U.S., and Lott explains the beast imagery representation offers a dominant cultural xenophobic understanding of black people. Yet these perceptions are not inherent. They're learned. They're learned through the popular texts that we form. The female primate is the body in which is occupied to continue the population of the oppressed. It is also the body that fails when science and the economy become intertwined, because whoever owns nature and has access to it has the capital and knowledge to decide how it will be used and with what resources. The scientific narratives in which he's currently serving are steeped in large colonial logics. And before the publication of Curious George, curiosity was theorized as a driving force of scientific discovery. And until now, scientific discovery was grounded in a modern positivist notion of curiosity as the eagerness to learn or know. But as the Oxford English Dictionary refers, it's not only a neutral and good sense, the desire of inclination to learn something new, but there's also this notion of curiosity as a negative. Curiosity, the blamable sense, the disposition to inquire too minutely, to undo, the desire which should not be known. To be curious is to allude to strangeness, qualities of the absurd. Aristotle understood curiosity with such skepticism, suggesting that it was aimless, witless tendency to get involved in which one has no place. In stark contrast to the described above, this denotation understands that to be curious is also to meddle, to become a nuisance or a hazard to society. The Curious George narrative retains a remarkable capacity to ease the negative connotations of each term. In each antidote, George's curiosity, while described as meddling, often ends in heroicness. George pranks the fire department, jumps into cages, frees animals from zoos, climbs on museum sculptures, rides on the tops of vehicles, breaks into factories, pries into almost anything that does not concern him. Yet by the end of every episode, George is celebrated. His curiosity, though dangerous, is habitually interpreted as heroic. He is curious. His curiosity is not understood as mischief, but instead his curiosity is to assume that if one employs curiosity without consequence, so long as they are desired to understand something which is not known. Such readings reveal the condition of possibility to question the rhetoric of curiosity. The clashing of curiosity discourse in this part of the section critically question and ask to caution against a grand push towards STEM educator. Children whose literal readings are systematic may learn from George much differently than their parents' nostalgia might predict. While children and parents learned STEM, Curious George was again refigured as a sign of the time when America's economy and military strength proved both central and essential to the global stage. Recasted as a Holocaust educator, this third set of discourses used George to create the condition to motivate the parents of the future to think about a time in which the U.S. was strong. In 2005, Louis Bourdon wrote the Curious George book like no other. Entitled The Journey That Saved Curious George, a wartime escape of Margaret and H.A. Reyes, Bourdon's narrative chronicles the pre-George adventures of his finders. The 75-page begins with the 1906 birth of German Reyes and lives through their lives, their marriage, their beginning as children's authors, and their move to Paris. They moved to Paris. They didn't plan on staying on their honeymoon, but they liked it so much they lived there for 2 years. But ultimately were forced to leave in 1940 because of the Nazi occupation of France. In 2040, Bourdon reports the Reyes grabbed minimal possessions, fled Paris by bicycle to the safety of the French-Spanish border, boarded a train to Lisbon, an ocean liner to Rio de Janeiro, and a year later made their way to New York, where they became the model citizens and public Curious George. In 2009, the Nebraska Institute of Holocaust Education debuted their museum exhibit, The Wartime Escape, Journey from France. In 2010, the New York Museum released their own version, Curious George Saves the Day, The Art of Margaret and H.A. Reyes. And finally, in 2017, documentary filmmaker Emma Yakiyama released her film, which has gotten incredible reviews and various different film circuits. Monkey Business, The Adventure of Curious George's Creators. The documentary includes the Reyes' escape from Nazi Paris, but contextualizes the film while focusing on the entire life of the Reyes. The Bourdon's book and museum exhibits, hereafter referred to as George Holocaust Discourses, offer a similar narrative. Curious George accompanies his literary parents on a dangerous journey to escape Paris prior to Nazi invasion and arrive in New York as immigrants who obtain the ultimate American dream. As model immigrants, they arrived, produced, and added to the economic growth of our country. And while each of these are different, they all come to question George as the alibi for the Reyes' innocence. The Reyes were Jewish but held Brazilian passports and were refugees, escaped German officials. Each time the army officials stopped and questioned the Reyes, H.A., the protector who takes charge, shows the officer his drawings of George, and the police write them off as children's artists. Again, George becomes the hero of the narrative. While these discourses perform and produce numerous insights on the Holocaust, and it's incidentally today is a Holocaust Remembrance Day, this retelling of the Holocaust narrative lacks the horror of persecution, forced displacement, of programs in ghettos and concentration camp, and instead provides us with a digestible, sanitized notion of the war. For adolescent audiences, the popularity of these memorialization infused Holocaust survivors with a jubilant notion of childhood innocence. For adult audiences, these discourses evoke nostalgia of a time in which America won the war. George's playful and whimsical lightheartedness is a distraction, I would argue, from the Holocaust horrors. The accounts ignore the torturous killings of 6 million Jews in favor of an adventure tale in which the fear of being caught becomes a momentary of suspense and excitement. The accounts omit the history of Nazi mobile killing units, concentration camps, death camps, the burning of babies, the slaughter and torture of people with disabilities, homosexual, political dissents, and all non-Aryan people, offering instead a relaxed introduction to this historical nightmare. It's not the typical Holocaust education that I had. While most U.S. middle schoolers learn the magnitude of violence from the painful writings of The Diary of Anne Frank and Elie Wiesel's Night, the Curious George, quote, educational depictions offer a happy narrative that privilege the rhetoric of adventure and American winning. While seamlessly disconnected from the earlier reconfigurations of the Holocaust that positioned George, these rays are actually part of a larger narrative endemic of the American dream. The recasting of George as a Holocaust hero and subsequent educator summons the revival of a World War II memories, a time when America's economic and military strength proved both central and essential on the global stage of the greatest generation. Curious George stories devoid of horror enable Americans to retell the story of the war in which the U.S. soldiers fought for freedom and the model immigrants like the Rays reaped the benefits of their victory. And these sanitized accounts fail to bear witness to the horrors of Nazi persecution. The narratives defend a contemporary currency awarded to Curious George and explain why audiences might have an aversion to critique him. Here one might consider the concerns of my Jewish family and several of my audience members. How could you disgrace Curious George when you know his writers escaped from the Holocaust? Curious George is important. We should remember him. He was featured at the 92nd Street Y in New York City. This is continuously what I'm concerned about. While its curious absence in these discourses is, of course, George's abduction from Africa. The lack of connection between the modern-day George as a Holocaust hero and the original George as a jubilant noble slave has serious implications for the way the U.S. citizens come to make sense of racial and religious violence. In spite of decades of scholarship committed to identity politics and post-colonialism, there's a lack of attention to the ways in which articles and icons like George as a STEM ambassador and his creators as Holocaust survivor help explain a public sentiment that, quote, one cannot simultaneously escape violence, in this instance the Holocaust, and perpetuate it at all. The falsified claim that the two cannot exist simultaneously unfairly situates two dominant narratives of spectacular violence in a rigged game of roulette in which the U.S. stain of slavery is discursively recolonized by the heroes of World War II. To be clear, I'm not denying the horror of the Holocaust, nor dismissing the courage that the Rays might had to endure escaping Nazi-controlled France. I'm well aware that any critique of the Holocaust narrative is not a popular position, yet the Americanization of the Holocaust, as some refer to it, is predicated on a collective memory that emerged in the 1940s and 1950s when American Jews responded to the decline in their religiousness with the growth of victim culture. Uniting Jewish Americans under the memory of the Holocaust became a means for identity and group consciousness. Central to this American public memory of the Holocaust was the triumphant roles that U.S. troops fighting Nazism in the rhetoric of uniqueness, one that cites the Holocaust as the most horrific genocide in history. Around the 1980s, while the American Holocaust Museum was being built in honor of the 6 million Jews who died in the hands of Nazi soldiers, the claim was that Jews were America's #1 community victim status. In 1990s, the Holocaust figures central to the American Museum. In fact, the National Holocaust Museum suggests that this is suggested reading for young adults. The comparison between American slavery, the Rwanda genocide, and other atrocities angered American Jews. The Jewish narrative is often focused on the primacy of the Holocaust, incomparable to others. Yet historian Peter Novick explains the contemporary American angry insistence on the uniqueness of the Holocaust is an intellectual denial of anything else. Uniqueness as a principal lesson of the American Holocaust education, Novak reasons, is effectually trivialized as other atrocities. And while some Jewish Americans claim the Holocaust's uniqueness heightens individual awareness for members of the Jewish diaspora, it also astutely highlights and promotes evasion of moral and ethical responsibilities. The uniqueness depends on the repeated assertion that whatever the United States has done to blacks, Native Americans, Vietnamese, pales in comparison to the Holocaust. Consequently, when, for example, the hundreds of years of slavery are raised in discourses of reparation or reconciliation, the American memory of the Holocaust provides an alibi to devalue the notion of historical responsibility. The hyperbolic positioning of the Rays as Holocaust survivors within a privileged American World War II narrative situates them, and thus Curious George, within a survival storyline. The uniqueness discourse of the Holocaust figures survivors as a heightened site of inquiry, thus rendering the Rays as individuals or anything that's associated with them as unsuitable for critique. The Rays and their motivation and innovation of Curious George becomes doubly protected from criticism. First, as a site of cultural childhood nostalgia, and then again as a figure of child of Holocaust survivors. In conclusion, my reading of Curious George does not call for a banishment, censorship, or destroying this series or any others like it. It is instead an invitation to reread, with critical sensibilities, the heroes we encourage young people to endure. Participating in such post-colonial rereadings enables parents and educators to introduce young readers with the important tools of critical reading praxis. When we read when we are young, it shapes our deeply understanding of who we are and who we are fashioned to be. This project is an appeal to teach critical reading, not just about Curious George, but to all students who are growing and learning about colonialism, identity formation, and civic society. As the government feeds STEM fields, we have even a greater responsibility here in the humanities to teach critical thinking with the vigor that we employ instructing the basics of phonics and reading. As students learn to read, they should read to learn, so that they can, from an early age, but also at any age, come to an understanding that stories are expected to be both ideologically neutral and normal, and often are not. Resistance is possible, but not always pervasive. The hegemonic narratives that we currently face in the news are based in literature, science, and nostalgia, and are always and already informing the colonial histories in which they are emerged. We now are at a critical juncture in which the politics of colonialism are both public and heavily steeped in the rhetorics of sexism, racism, anti-Semitism, and various visceral forms of violence. Yet the sounds of change can be heard, and the charge must be made. We must be grounded in both caution and courage to challenge the colonial narratives and resist injustice. Thank you. So I'm open for questions if you have any. No, I don't think that Curious George independently led to the promotion of STEM education. What I think is that Curious George is part of a colonial canon that gets stemmed from various different directions and plays a role. Yet, what fascinated me about Curious George specifically is while a lot of those texts in their colonial canon is criticized, I mean, even something like Dora the Explorer, you can find tons of stuff on her, you know, Mickey Mouse and Dr. Seuss, that George just seems to be exempt from academic critique. And so that's what fascinates me, but I don't think that these books single-handedly, or these programs single-handedly made that change. I think they were part of a colonial canon that gets infused and teaches our children this benevolent form of colonialism. Thanks. Yeah.
How would you approach sharing that story in an educated and critical manner with your child?
So, my children are 8 now, and they're certainly old enough to begin, you know, this critical lens. And so, you know, I might take that book off the shelf and read it to them again and say, would you like your daddy to be like the man in the yellow hat? Or like, doesn't this kind of seem, you know, do you think what he does is safe? You know, would you like to be safe like this? You know, and so we ask questions about both that text and other texts. I mean, one of the biggest challenges I find is that a lot of parents use, screen time or book time as kind of an escape to be able to do the daily requirements of life. But I think it's really important to know what it is that our children are learning from narratives like Disney and The Cat in the Hat and all sorts of these different stories, to be able to have those conversations with them. So obviously my newborn children, we didn't talk so much about it, right? But as they get older, they remember the stories. I mean, I never really have to introduce Curious George to audience members. They all know it. I have pictures of me with a big Curious George doll in my crib. So there's a lot of stories like that. Many people remember The Cat in the Hat, and there's a great book that was just written entitled Was the Cat in the Hat Black? And talks about kind of the racism embedded in Dr. Seuss work. And to be able to go back to that book with children and say, let's read this. What do you think about this move? What do you think about this character? Begins to get them to be aware. I've said to my children, why is it that Nala in The Lion King can beat up Simba, yet when Simba leaves town, she can't beat off the hyena. She has to go find Simba, right? And so we begin to talk about gender in that way. Oh, I don't know. And that's how that conversation begins. Thanks. That was a good question. Yeah.
How does the man in the yellow hat fit into the narrative of American exceptionalism, or does he?
Well, I think he is the colonizer, right? And a lot of contemporary narratives, just was done with the movie, tries to kind of revise or alter this old colonization story. But as the case is here, and often in other stories, there's been a great piece by Ken Ono that was wrote about Pocahontas, in which the similar event happens, where you get kind of a new colonizing narrative, where stealing African sites is okay, just not like stealing animals is okay, right? So it becomes this, we'll show you the old colonizer, we all know that's bad, but here's like a new hip colonizer that we can all stand behind. So I think that's how kind of, unfortunately, it was a real great opportunity for them to update the man in the yellow hat, perhaps even critique his craziness, but really they only made it worse.
So, I have a question. If the man in the yellow hat is the colonizer, and it's man, then what kind of, how are women implicated, or how is femininity implicated in American culture?
In this text or in general?
In this text.
So, incidentally, Curious George, from the beginning to now, doesn't really feature any women. They're always bystanders. There is, in fact, on the 7th book, the Boston Hospital wanted the Rays to write a book to get children more comfortable with being in the hospital, and the doctor featured in that narrative was a woman. This was kind of a big deal because she was a working woman. And it was, 1976. So that was... But really, women don't play a role in this text whatsoever. And I don't think, I began to theorize, what would happen if the woman was here? Now, in the later movie, the man in the yellow hat does establish some sort of relationship, kind of, with the teacher who brings her class to the museum. But it's real PC, and you don't really see anything made of it. George has friends. He's got animal friends, and he's got people friends. None of his close friends are women, right? He's pretty good friends with the doorman, the Italian restaurant owner, the doorman's dog, but no female characters. So there's a real absence of femininity, but what is fascinating is that girls really like this narrative, and his antics is this very kind of boys will be boys, we can do crazy things because we're boys, which I find to be a really contemporary narrative that's floating around, what's acceptable for young children if boys is different than from what's girls. And I don't actually think that this type of narrative would be possible if he was featured. I mean, they never say Curious George is a boy, But he is named after George Washington, so one could presume that he is a boy, or a monkey boy. But there's no girls in it, and I don't think it would be possible, because at the times in which the original narrative was set, to be a girl and participate in these antics, and I think even now, would be fully unacceptable. So I think there's a real absence of a feminine narrative, and from a post-colonial perspective, I'm always interested in what's both in the text and what's obviously absent. Thanks.
Curious George is given a name, but the man in the yellow hat is more or less described by his specific clothing choices, and then given a name later, I guess after that. Do you think that weakens the argument for the man in the yellow hat as a symbol of the powerful?
No, I actually think it strengthens it. That's a good question. I think anonymity provides the opportunity for anybody to fill that role. I mean, this is why the army is the army of one, right? And you see in army advertisements, they never, or in the famous picture of Iwo Jima, right? When you don't name the heroes, then anybody could be the hero. Anybody could be the man in the yellow hat who, well, I describe him as colonizer. Many people think that he's a great character. And so anybody can then fill that role. Yeah.
You talked about how Curious George reinforces like masculine ideals, but to what extent would you consider it as a child engaging with the narrative, empathizing with George on an ungendered level, and that he was an animal if it seems to be like outside of gender? So like in what ways would you think he would encourage or reproduce an idea of play or curiosity that is separate from traditional narratives?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that a lot of people like George because he's so playful. That he could do things that only children would desire but know they couldn't do. So in many instances, he'll like grab a set of balloons and he's so light that the balloons take him up and take him places. Or he goes to the moon in rocket ships by accident. All sorts of adventures that children of any gender would imagine to be able to do. And I think that perhaps is the possibilities, the productive elements of the text. But I don't think that denies the limitations of the text. But that is certainly what PBS and Hulu, who now has a endless streaming television show dedicated to Curious George 24/7, right? They bank on that as, and there's this notion. I mean, I'm part of a moms group, where we all hang out because we're all moms, and even then, this is very educated. People were like, really, Curious George? Like, you had to do Curious George, and traditionally, I don't write about children's books. I'm more occupied with magazines and films geared towards adult audiences. But I always come to my projects because they kind of call to me. While I was trying to offer my children exactly what you say, that playful, adventurous excitement, it was embedded in such a disturbing narrative that had to be shared. So, it does provide an opportunity for us to talk to people about it. I mean, I would even, I bring this into my my visual rhetoric class, and I say, here's the first 5 pages of Curious George. Give it a read. What do you think? And people are stunned. But they all know the story. But they remember that playful, whimsical side that you speak to. Thank you. Yeah.
So you talk about the man in the yellow hat as being a father figure of sorts, but Curious George has no female figures.
No.
Female figures at all. So I wonder if the lack of a mother figure or a caretaker allows him to do these kind of wild, off-the-wall things. So I was wondering how that's, it kind of seems to me, I don't know if in your reading you've gotten any of this, that a female figure, the lack of a female figure allows for exploration and curiosity. So then maybe the presence of that disciplinarian
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, that's what I was trying to get at with the comparison to Where the Wild Things Are, right? That the story would not be possible if a female figure was present. Now, what's interesting, where I thought you were going, that I hadn't thought about, is then how does this change something like the Google advertisement, where the females, I mean, there's an absence of males entirely, except for her reading about George, right? In fact, in this, I would have played it, but it was a little long. There's a scene in which they Google grandma, right? And grandma gets invited. So this is all like female, food-oriented, at-home, domestic narrative in which George is invited, right? And so I'm not quite sure what to make of that yet. But if you have ideas, I'd love to hear them.
As soon as I saw that ad, or as soon as you started describing that advertisement, I mean, the thing that stuck out the most to me was like white blonde.
Yes.
White blonde, like
Yeah.
the baby of the colonizer.
Yeah.
Not that I want to pick on blonde hair, white.
Yeah, I mean, there's no talk about father. He's presumably at work, I guess. I don't know.
Right. But maybe they were trying to appeal more to women. These people have ideas.
Yes.
You said that this was kind of off the beaten path of things you choose to research and write about. Was there ever a pull to step away from it, or did you always feel driven to learn and speak about this in the absence of what you found?
Yeah, so this book project has taken longer than I would have liked, partly because every time I thought I was done, this like last year, this documentary came out, and I was like, oh dear. You know what I mean? I mean, that's the hard thing as a researcher talking about something that's contemporary, right? It's always happening. There were two moments where I was pulled away. One was I had a colleague who was doing really amazing research, and I was doing some editing for her, and I said, what the hell am I doing? You know, who is going to care about Curious George? And so I stepped away for a while, and then she said, why have you dropped this project? And I was like, I haven't dropped it. It's just kind of on the back burner. And she was like, no, it's hot, because 2 years ago was the 75th anniversary of Curious George. She said, no, this is like what's hot. Second hiatus was actually not my fault. I don't know how much you know about academic publishing, but it often takes about 7 months to get a big publisher to send a book out for review, because they pay big publishers. And luckily I was past the 10-year promotion time and wasn't like stressing out too much. So I mean, that was kind of I didn't want to go on and work on it in directions that the publisher wasn't going to send me in. So I took that time to work on other projects. So those were kind of my two leave times. So now I'm back at it. Yeah.
Just on this point of the post-colonial project incorporating in white women and the necessity of sort of indoctrinating those who have grown up in after eras of the feminist movement and ongoing feminist activism is I think to reestablish that that position of whiteness and women are now being visible and so called to the forefront of, okay, if we can get a white liberal feminist movement on board with these ideas, then they will be less apt to see and look into and be critical about race and about, imperialism and all of the other aspects.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
That advertisement sees the curiosity as a mechanism of empowerment.
Yes, absolutely.
George isn't as empowered, he's continually being hit by the man who have it, and it's important, right?
But he's always the hero at the end.
Well,
Like,
yes, but he's also given home and put back into that. I mean, I think that there's some of that
Yeah.
I don't know. I think if you're talking about like how to implicate women in this story, it makes complete sense that in the advertisement it would be the mom telling it to the young girl, because if it's the colonizer's job, right, to go out and colonize, it's the woman or the mother's job to
Yes.
teach the colonizing canon to the children.
Yes.
So that, to me, that makes it made complete sense. And then also the what you spoke about in terms of gender, maybe they were thinking about it in terms of let's have a little girl play it, because Curious George doesn't have a gender, and even though he seems like very boyish, boys will be boys, girls can also participate in this narrative.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I really like this idea that the mother's job is to kind of teach the children the colonizing narratives that the men are out doing. It's smart. I'll have to get your name so I can give you credit for that contribution. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you would talk a little bit about maybe the speciesism that is if you could elaborate maybe some of the thoughts about that.
Yeah, so one version of the kind of STEM primate chapter, if you will, is published in a journal called, I'll remember in a second. It's a British journal, in which we talk about kind of the notion of species gaining in intellectual maturity and the ways in which, is this what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was just kind of thinking, he's not just a colonist, but it seems like the man in yellow has a zookeeper.
He's not a zookeeper.
I know, I mean,
Oh.
in terms of, he has, George goes out and does things, comes back into his sort of cage, goes out and does things, comes back into his cage. And it seems like that you've done a lot of work in terms of theorizing maybe the racial implications behind the colonizer in George. I was wondering if you thought much about the species that we should be doing.
Well, there's a big debate about George being a monkey because he doesn't have a tail. Okay, and while like nobody debates the legitimacy of Big Bird being a bird, there's a huge discourse, like pretty big, about whether or not George is a monkey. And I think probably people are interested in his monkeyness because he doesn't speak, so maybe he can't justify his monkeyness. I'm not quite sure. So I looked into that, and the reason he actually doesn't have a tail is that in the original novel of Cecilia and the Nine Monkeys, Cecilia's this giraffe, and the monkeys are stuck on one side of a cliff, and they can't get across, and so Cecilia befriends them, and she lays down, and they walk across her neck, and whatever. So at the end of that book, there's a song, and they use the giraffe as the treble clef and the monkeys as the notes. But if they had a tail, the notes would extend to the next line of music. So H.A. decided it was better for his illustration to cut off the tail of the monkey. Now, incidentally, the Rays also owned monkeys that they tried to bring from Brazil to Paris. That didn't work so well. Climates did not allow, and the monkeys died. But there's lots of discussion of, like, in biology magazines and zoology magazines about what type of monkey George really was. And in fact, he's not, like, a known monkey, because there's no monkey without a tail. You could be a primate or an ape without a tail, but not a monkey. So I'm not quite sure if I got to your question, but I definitely am. There's a huge section of this. Textual Practice is the name of the book. It's the name of the journal. It's a British journal, and it focuses specifically on this kind of STEM education, primates, our relationship with primates, the relationship, and it looks at, this section looks at other representations of beasts, Planet of the Apes, King Kong, right? Lots of different versions of popular media that look at the beast and the primate and how we relate to them in popular culture. Yeah.
I wonder if there's some Curious George being so curious of STEM, and him now being like this icon that allows the narrative that girls can enter the STEM field because a monkey can do it, so can they. So I wonder if there's equivocation that's happening.
Well, I think the reason that he was picked up for STEM was because I believe, and my date might be wrong, so correct me if you know, I believe in 1992, it was determined that if public broadcasting dollars were being used for children's programming, the programming had to have an educational narrative that accompanied it, right? And so while George's curiosity was kind of interesting for a while, once the films came out and the shows came out, it became accentuated. And then the shows led to, I'll show you. So this is the shows. This was really interesting. This is another reason why I slowed down. Last year they put out a third Curious George movie entitled Curious George Back to the Jungle. But anyway, so this is like an exhibit that they have. And there's lots of other kind of, so these are two examples. This is the musical here, but this one at the bottom, there's all these exhibits at children's museums, and they're really interactive. And so so the way they kind of sell this is, get young kids involved with Curious George, and they'll learn how to weigh things, how weather works, what gravity is, blah, blah, blah. So I think that it was there for a while, but you're right that it's really hyper visual now. And I think it was because of that 1992 children's educational law. Yeah.
This slide is really interesting to me because, like, my 5-year-old made me watch Blue Fest probably a good dozen times. And when I'm thinking about the idea of colonialism and how George was really excited because he gets this opportunity to dress up and become the man with the yellow hat in that moment. And it's kind of interesting to think about how there's like this desire, or culturally oppressive desire to transform minorities into the colonizers.
That's really smart. My kids are actually afraid of Blue Fest. They find it incredibly scary.
The hat, yeah, 'cause he takes hats.
Yeah, so I hadn't really had the opportunity to do that critical reflection. That's good. Thanks. Any last questions? I really appreciate your opportunity to share with me your insights. Yeah.
I just was wondering if you could explain a little about how maybe your archive experience. It seems like you found some really interesting artifacts that would be on screen just with some really normal.
Yeah, so this is a huge brand, right? Curious George is a brand, he's huge. And when H.A. died, Margaret became very protective over how Curious George was going to be used. She pored over every document herself, every costume, everything. And she saved every single piece of paper, every fan letter she got. And as she got older, they didn't have any children of their own, so she needed a caretaker, right, because she was aging and she just had constraints. So she hired this woman she found in the paper to be her caretaker. And this woman subsequently also would help her negotiate these contracts with, Universal Studios and all the different companies she was working with, the Curious George store, etc. And then she had a huge 90th birthday party, and she got so many boxes of fan mail. I can't even tell you. So many hours in southern Mississippi's archives, which are incredibly impressive. And then she died shortly thereafter, and the caretaker donated all of the paper, anything that had to do with Curious George, to the McGraw-Hill archive, because it's a children's archive in Hattiesboro at the University of Southern Mississippi, and they did an immaculate job of organizing it into over 300 boxes of folders that chronologically move through letters and contracts, and they were in a lot of legal disputes of, and you know, I hadn't done much archival work up to that point, but I did a lot of preparation. I went to my local archive, I talked to archivists, and I talked to other scholars, and they said, really just be open. Be open to what you find. And that was the best advice I could give students or anybody doing archival research. Really to just go there, sit there and read, and take lots of pictures of what you find, so that I have this huge collection. And the archivists there were so open and welcoming to researchers that I could call them and say, you know, inbox 65, folder number 4, can you send me a copy of that letter, you know, whatever it may be. And it's been a huge resource for me. So it was a really great experience. So I planned to spend 5 days there, because it only opened during the week. So I went on a Monday thinking I would stay till Friday. And by Thursday, while I hadn't read everything, I felt like kind of done. I just had so many ideas. Like, I went on this hunt for the, you know, when I saw the story about I'm going to cut off the tails because they don't fit in this narrative, I had these moments of like, oh, that makes so much sense. And I had like too many of these moments, and I wasn't digesting. So I decided like Thursday night I'm going to head out, and if I need to go back, I'll go back. Thank you so much for your time braving the blizzard.